And now that you know like a little bit about me, I'm just going to start off the lecture with defining like a few terms that I'll use throughout, just so that everyone's like on the exact same page and it's really clear what I'm talking about. But if you have any questions at all, like any of y'all are confused about anything I'm talking about, just feel free to interrupt and I'll try to answer the best I can. Uh, so the first term I'm going to use is consequence. Now, this may have like a negative connotation when used in everyday life, but really consequences can be either positive or negative, and they're really just the effect, result, or the outcome of something occurring, um, due to an action, right? Um, Next, disadvantages. You've probably heard them commonly called a DA or the shortened word disad. Just to get a quick poll, if everyone could like react with the hand raise emoji or something, does who knows like the four parts of a disad? Okay. So I see two people. Okay. I'll just like sort of cover the basics, not like super in depth then like kind of go lighter on them. But if any of y'all like have follow-up questions as a result, um, then yeah, you can feel free to ask. To classify a disadvantage, they're like an off-case argument. I'm sure a lot of y'all know that. Um, that's just the like an off-case argument. The opposite is an on-case argument, which is commonly referred to just like case that directly refutes or answers the claims made by the affirmative from the case. In contrast, an off-case argument is still linked to the affirmative because it's based off the effect or consequence of the affirmative case, but it doesn't directly refute the claims made in the affirmative case. Um, so now that you know like how it's classified at the fundamental level, a disadvantage is a consequence, but this time we are going to classify it as negative, and it's caused by the passage of the plan or an endorsement of the affirmative method. So if you were to pass, the United States federal government were to do whatever the affirmative is like proposing they should do, the negatives disadvantage is like a reason why the passage of that plan or implementation of that plan would cause a negative downside or that negative consequence. Subsequently, or like by effect, this means that every disadvantage to the plan is also an advantage to the status quo. I should have defined this at the top, but status quo, for those of you who don't know, is just a word for the way that things are now, right? It could also be described as the world that we live in, like as is, without any changes or like the AF's hypothetical plan. The easiest way I think to like conceptualize this is it's as a reason like why the judge would prefer not to do anything or why they should prefer not to pass the plan and just keep the world as is. Chandon Klimko is going to cover this more in depth during the counterplan lecture, but disadvantages can also be reasons why a counterplan is more preferable to the plan. Imagine you had an affirmative plan and a negative counterplan. They both solve the same exact thing equally as well, right? In this hypothetical. So the negative needs a reason why the counterplan is better than the plan. That's usually going to be the disadvantage. Um, okay, now moving on to the structure. There's four parts to the disadvantage. I'm just going to cover these for those like who aren't super familiar. Uniqueness, link, internal link, impact. Every single disadvantage will have these four parts. They all have uniqueness, link, internal link, impact. Even if this is like a lot of people get confused over this, I feel, but even if the disad is comprised of less than four cards or pieces of evidence, right? It is not a requirement that each part of the disad has its own news article. Often the internal link and impact might be combined, or the link and internal link, or uniqueness and the internal link. Okay, starting in order, what does uniqueness mean? Unique, this is obviously a word in English, but very rarely a word you would use to describe things like the term uniqueness in the context of debate. Um, the way I like think of uniqueness is it's why like it's unique that the like business or like events that the disad is in the context of why those are happening right now. So if you're negative and reading a disad that's unique, the argument would be that the status quo, you're going to find that things are not falling out of control, i.e., the disadvantage is not happening right now. You want your uniqueness evidence to paint a picture of things being as stable and okay as like possible in that moment, right? Think about it another way, right? If the disad didn't have uniqueness, things weren't fine right now. That also means that the disadvantage could be happening right now with or without the plan. So whether or not you pass the plan, the disad would happen in the status quo, meaning that shouldn't be a reason that the judge shouldn't prefer the plan if the disad, isn't directly caused by the plan. So that's why it's so important for the negative. Sorry. That's why it's so important for the negative to win uniqueness, because they have to prove that things are fine in the status quo. For example, you probably know that like passing climate legislation is hard because it's politically contentious, right? So that fact means that passing an affirmative that attempts to do climate policy would be politically contentious. Last season, on the fiscal redistribution topic, a common disad that people would read is that this, or like any politically contentious affirmative, has a risk of causing Congress to backlash onto another policy. And then they argue that the thing they would backlash onto is a bill that contains aid for Ukraine. In this scenario, uniqueness would be the fact that aid is going to pass, that everything is all right in the status quo. And I'll show some examples like down the line, so you'll be able to get like a really clear idea of what exactly uniqueness evidence contains, the warrants in there, etc. Okay. Anyone have questions about uniqueness so far? Okay, cool. The link. Second part of a disadvantage, it's basically what does a plan cost? What is the thing that causes the chain reaction of this disadvantage to start happening? Maybe the plan spends a lot of money and that's the link to like an economy disadvantage. Maybe the plan is super unpopular and it triggers like political backlash, like I discussed above. So it's the reason why the plan causes the disadvantage to happen, right? My favorite analogy is if you think about disadvantages, like a whole bunch of dominoes like lined up in a row. It's like the link is the push that like causes the first domino to like tumble down and start the chain reaction. So moving on to the third part of a disadvantage, the internal link. It's basically like, what does that lead to, right? You can think about it like what's in the next step of the series of dominoes, right? So it's the thing that connects the link to the impact. It can be like, I think it's better explained as like a section because there can be multiple internal links. So like the Ukraine aid politics disadvantage I was talking about earlier, I would argue there'd be multiple internal links in that because the link would be like, it causes political backlash. Internal link would be like aid doesn't pass. So that's one internal link. But then you need a reason why that matters. So like second internal link would be like Ukraine really needs that aid, Third internal link, if they don't get the aid, they're going to lose to Russia. So that's like three sort of big ones. So it's honestly better described as like a section that leads up to the impact. So finally, the fourth part of a disadvantage is what's the ultimate consequence? What's the bad thing that happens as a result of the plan happening? So the impact is like where you get to like something leads to something leads to like nuclear war, for example. That's a pretty common impact. Well, nuclear war would be quote unquote your terminal impact to the disadvantage or passing the plan. Nuclear war and climate change, I would say, are like the two most common impacts, but you'll see like tons of different ones: inequality, tech development, AI growth, economic crisis, all common impacts. Those would all be your terminal impact, the final consequence, the impact of the disadvantage. So going back, just to like kind of wrap up all those sections, I'm gonna like refresh like the domino metaphor. So your uniqueness is like all the dominoes are lined up. They could obviously fall, but none of them are falling right now. So if we don't do anything, they'll stand up, they'll be fine. The link is like the plan pushes the first domino down. The internal link is like the whole chain of dominoes falls. And then the impact is whatever comes as a result of like all the dominoes falling. So I already covered SADs. I think look in terms of evidence, they don't necessarily have to be four cards. So I'll briefly describe like what one could look like before showing some examples. So like in a practical debate, I'll use an example of like, let's say like a presidential elections disadvantage. So I'm sure y'all all know like the next presidential elections in November. And so this version of a disad would be like, it could be called like the Trump bad elections disad, right? So the argument is basically like that the disad saying is like Trump would be a really bad second term president. The uniqueness would be like probably like polling data or like news articles that say Donald Trump will lose the 2024 elections now. You would read a piece of evidence that establishes why he would lose. Like either that's polling data, um, something like that, like his approval rating's really low. So your uniqueness is like he's losing the 2024 elections now. Basically, things are fine, things will be fine. So then you get to the link. This year's topic is intellectual property rights. So it's to strengthen protections. So the link could be like strengthening protections on intellectual property are really unpopular with voters who are like on the fence, like they're sort of voting for Biden now, but they're considering voting for Trump. Their argument is like when you pass the plan would be something that's really unpopular with like what are termed swing voters, right? So the plan would make Biden look a lot worse over intellectual property law. That's the link, right? Um, and then the internal link would be like that causes him to, and this is like one where like probably the internal link is not so much a section, but like a single thing, like causes him to lose the election. Pretty straightforward. Impact would be like a bunch of things like um, if Trump wins a second term, causes like maybe war with North Korea, Iran, other countries. So that's sort of the terminal impact of this. Um, and I mean, this goes for like every disad now. So like kind of thinking more broadly, if you're negative, ideally you want like a really big impact or something that's like so big that it actually like quote unquote outweighs like the affirmative case. So even though the plan like could solve a lot of good things, right? The mere fact that the plan causes a disadvantage is enough to not want to vote for it. Um, so, and then like I'll talk about like how you compare impacts in a second. But basically just like the really big negative consequences has to outweigh all of the benefits of the plan. And that's the reason why the judge should prefer the status quo, right? Um, okay. Any questions about anything I've said so far? Okay. Perfect. I'll move into, or actually, Ravi, can I share my screen? Okay,
Yeah.
awesome. Okay, can everyone see my screen? Perfect. Okay, so this is, I just like kind of wanted to help you all visualize some of the examples I was talking about. This is the Ukraine politics disad I was talking about. So you'll notice uniqueness evidence is like a bit old now because this is from the TOC. But it's like it's going to pass now. It's really like narrow. Then a link. So like last year was like economics. So it's like reworking like fiscality, derails like the legislative agenda in Congress. Then without passage, Ukraine loses. And then what I was talking about, like internal links can be sections. Uh, you won't like specify in like a tag or something, but like within the card itself, you see like there's lots of highlighting on like why they desperately need this additional aid, right? Like what it would include, um, why this is like essential. Then you would have like your impact. So what this causes, in this case, like nuclear war. And this like goes back to what I was talking about making sure that your impact is like as large as possible. When you have like larger ones such as nuclear war, climate change, it's a lot easier to argue that like a lot of the affirmatives impacts fall under that category, which I'll go into more detail. The elections disad. So like Biden's winning now. The plan shifts his strategy like too far left, which we're arguing like alienates like swing voters, quote unquote. those that like are voting for Biden, but like might get like turned off by like whatever his agenda is, then your impact like Trump bad. Let me see. So that's like an example of like a three-card disad, right? It's like your uniqueness, your link, and then like this is one example I gave of like the internal link is really intuitive. So you just need your impact card. Another three-card one, the inflation disad last year was really popular. It's like the economy is doing great right now. That'd be your uniqueness. Why the status quo is preferable. Your link, the plan causes like a lot of like negative economic effects. And then that causes like impact. And this one like is an example of when the internal link and impact card are combined. You can see the brands card is detailing like why inflation is like bad. This card establishes the link about like why the plan causes inflation. And then this is like the internal link of like inflation destabilizes the world. And then like what that means, fatal spark, blah, blah. Then the last two, like oil disad, this is like also pretty similar to a politics, or it's not like a politics disad, but like same idea, uniqueness, oil prices doing fine, an AF that like any affirmative that transitions to like or renewables, something of that nature is going to kill oil prices. That's your link. Internal link is that they're key to prevent collapse of like Russia, and then impact card if Russia collapsed, extinction because like Putin will like lash out. And then last example is this one's like a bit more complex, which is why I saved it for last. But this was there was a common affirmative last year called like the degrowth affirmative that said like the economy is so unsustainable that the thing we should do is like quote unquote degrow it. Like we should, when the next recession happens, we should just like let the recession happen and basically go back to how we were living like 500 years ago, like less modern technology, less energy intensive things. So this disad is like, no, we need growth, to win the tech race. Then link to like degrowth or whatever, like that like annihilates growth. And then dominating like this would be your internal link, like dominating global markets is like good. Otherwise, impact will lose tech competitiveness, right? Like American tech won't be seen as good as tech from like the CCP, or like, yeah, I mainly centered on around China. So any questions over any of those disads? Okay. Then I will move on to impact calculus. Okay. So there's three main parts of impact calculus. First is magnitude. So how big is the impact? These can take like, I mean, there's lots of different ways you can quantify an impact, like deaths, suffering, future lives. Really quick, I'll like dive in like some disads. Uh, I don't know if any of y'all have heard like the term. I'm sure y'all have like existential risks is basically like a risk that is threatens the like very survivability of like our species. If it happens, like that impact were to happen, we'd all be like gone. It's causes extinction. Then there's like some impacts that rely on what are called ESC risks, which is basically like suffering risk. So like an AI disad, for example, would be like AI would, even if we're not dead, AI might like enslave us like hundreds of years in the future. They could like revive past people that like spoke out against AI and just like inflict infinite suffering onto them. So people sometimes argue like suffering risk outweigh like existential risk because there's like a much greater capacity for suffering. I thought I'd just include that in case any of y'all come across like an ESC risk and aren't sure what to do. probability is the next component of impact calculus, the next pillar, which is, I mean, it's pretty straightforward. How likely is the impact? You'll often see like a common argument, and people often will like immediately bring this up in cross-sects if they have like nothing better to ask about, which is like if an impact of a disad is like climate change or something, it's going to be like, okay, that's been going on for a while. Like, when's the brink? When does it cause extinction, as your cards talk about? So that would be an example of like a systemic impact, right? An ongoing one. And that's like in comparison to like a future, like future predictions, right? So on systemic impacts, it's probably much easier to win, that it's more probable because it's going on like in the present. You have like quote unquote empirical like evidence from the past that it's like an impact, but you might find that the magnitude is not going to be as large because it has been going on in the past and it hasn't caused like mass extinction or whatever you're trying to claim. Lastly, time frame, how quickly an impact will happen. This is best used as like a tiebreaker with like different impacts interacting with one another, or when there's like a sequencing question. So a common phrase, sorry, that a lot of debaters like to say, including myself, is, quote, time frame controls the direction of magnitude. So this is like explicit judge instruction, right? Essentially, you are talking directly to the judge. You are giving them instructions on how they should evaluate the debate, evaluate the disadvantage. Logically, you're trying to appeal, like logically, you can only die once, to the judge, trying to get them to understand that, which means that the disadvantage, because it comes before, the affirmative's case, like time frame wise, it comes before their impacts. Ours happens in a month, theirs happens in a year. Logically, you would stop the one that happens in a month because maybe after that there's a chance that you can stop the impact that happens in a year, right? Impact calculus can also take place on the link/uniqueness level. So there's two common phrases with this one, and they're kind of the opposite of each other. First is that uniqueness controls the direction of the link. The root of this argument is based around the idea that if you're decisively winning one part of the debate, right? So let's say like in a hypothetical, I'm negative, I'm reading a disadvantage, a politics one about how the plan, there's some climate bill that's going to pass now, but the plan just absolutely derails it, right? The affirmative has said like, no, the bill won't pass, and like we don't like derail the like agenda or anything. But I'm negative, I'm good at debating uniqueness, let's say. So I'm just like absolutely like way ahead of the affirmative. It's like so clear cut, the bill will pass in the status quo. If that's true, then that means like that should, quote, control the direction of the link, right? If I'm decisively ahead on uniqueness, even a small risk of a link should be sufficiently like sufficient for the judge to vote negative on the disadvantage. Now, there's the exact opposite, which is the link controls the direction of uniqueness, right? You should say, if you're trying to make this argument, because you think maybe you're behind on uniqueness, you should say uniqueness is like probabilistic, right? It's, inherent, it's like always going to be based in uncertainty. There's always going to be some statistic. Like, how does a judge like really evaluate like 50% risk of uniqueness versus like 75% risk? Like, that's not like super clear cut. Whereas we're decisively winning the link, right? If like the politics example, I'm decisively winning that passing the plan causes like political backlash that is very distinct from the status quo. So that means the judge should prioritize even a small risk that the plan changes the status quo. And both of these are most commonly used when you're far ahead on one part of the disad. As I was talking about earlier on the time frame controls the direction of like magnitude for impact calculus. All of these phrases, like any of the three, offer judge instruction for how the judge should frame the debate. And that's really important because judges often like have a hard time at the end of a debate sifting through like how to line up arguments. Like when you said this, what did you mean it to like indict or like apply to, right? Because you might have answered something they said, but say like you said it at a different part in your speech than when they said it, or like you didn't reference the thing they said when you were answering it, then the judge is going to like have a hard time giving you credit for that, which is why judge instruction is key to like explain how they should frame the debate. And when judge instruction is done well, often you'll find that the judge will be very favorable to them. Like I've had like novice debates I've judged where I'm going to be honest, I don't really know what's going on because it's sort of all over the place. But like in like a final rebuttal, if a novice like just like explains like, yes, this debate is messy, I'll explain why the disadvantage comes before the plan, like very clear cut, I'm much more amenable to voting for them. Okay. Briefly, extending the disad into the block. Okay. Your impact framing, impact calculus should go at the top. The best way that this is done or like acted upon is you explain how the disad's impacts, quote unquote, outweigh the AF, right? Or how it potentially like subsumes or is larger, right? The common phrasing for this is like quote unquote turns. So like you'd say like the disad outweighs and turns the AF, right? And I think the easiest way to understand like what that means is like through examples. So let me think. Like let's say I'm comparing the disad is nuclear war and the affirmative read an impact about like food wars, right? Well, you'd say like even if the food wars like are supposed to like go nuclear, for example, right? It's like let's say we're winning, like our nuclear war is faster, right? It has a higher time frame. So I'd say like it turns food wars, like nuclear war turns food wars because when nuclear war happens, right? There's like this phenomenon called like nuclear winter where a bunch of like ash is like thrown into the atmosphere. It blocks out the sun, which leads to like freezing and means we can't grow food. So we're able to grow less and less food. That sounds like a perfect condition for a food war, right? Like we're not able to farm as much, tensions are already going to be really high. So we've quote unquote turned the food wars impact because um, because by like voting negative and avoiding nuclear war, you're also avoiding like a bunch of food wars. So next, I'll talk about answering the disadvantage, or actually I should check in. Does anyone have any questions so far on anything I've said? Y'all can also like feel free if you don't want to like unmute and talk, you can throw them in like chat and I can read. But I'll come back to chat in a second after this section. So if you do have a question, just throw it in there and I'll get to it after this. So answering the disad, this is just as important as knowing how to go for it. On the affirmative, the thing that like I do at least, and has been recommended to me by many varsity debaters, much better than me or my coaches, or like LASA alums. You want to order the arguments in the 2AC by the level of relative importance. So that means what you think is the best direct response. The good news is this is usually in direct contestation with what the 1NC has said. You'd be like, there's no uniqueness, there's no link, there's no internal link, there's no impact. So I'll give some examples based off politics. Let's say it's the Ukraine one, right? Uniqueness is like Ukraine aid will pass now. Link is the plan's politically unpopular. The internal link is that causes backlash. Um, or I guess that's the link is it causes backlash. Internal link would be like that causes Ukraine to lose the war. Impact would be like Russia like goes like batshit crazy, like nuclear war. So like thinking about like affirmative arguments against this, like directly contesting, it'd be to answer uniqueness, the affirmative would be like, no, aid is not going to pass now. There's your no uniqueness argument. The no link argument would be no, the plan is not politically unpopular. The internal link argument would be like, no, Ukraine is not losing the war, even if it doesn't get this aid package. The no impact argument would be like, no, Putin's actually like a pretty smart leader, and he's not going to like anger like all the European states and cause like more escalation. So the good thing about disads is because the arguments against them are usually in direct contestation, it's pretty easy to, even if you don't have evidence, you can come up with like analytics, which are just like arguments that don't have an article backing them. They're just stuff you came up with on the fly. Even if it's just analytics, a lot of smart analytics can take out a really bad piece of evidence or a really bad disad that doesn't make a lot of sense. Um, and if y'all are like ever looking for like a drill on like how to improve your disad debating, I think like a really good idea is to um, just open up like pretend you're reading like some affirmative, have someone send like, or you can just find a bunch of different disads that apply to it, 5 or 6, and then just go like disad by disad, making a bunch of like analytical arguments against it, thinking about how to best set up no link, no uniqueness, no internal link, no impact arguments. And in terms of ordering those, again, it should be by relative importance. So like what you think is the best, what you think is the best argument against it. Like, let's say with the Ukraine one, it's like, no, Ukraine aid is not going to pass. Well, depending on like what time of the year, that could actually be very true. Like Republicans were like pretty firmly against passing Ukraine at certain points. Whereas the link argument that's like, no, the plan's not politically unpopular, but the plan is like expanding Social Security, like that's probably not very true. So in that case, you probably want to prioritize and put the no uniqueness arguments at the top of your 2AC disad flow. Now, some more advanced AF arguments you can make against the disad. First is that the affirmative solves the disad, right? Think about this as if you had an AF that solved climate change, and the disad also had an impact about climate change. Well, it seems logical you should vote AF because you can both solve climate change and whatever the F's impacts are. And like, I don't know if this is an easier way to conceptualize it, but it's like the best way is that the AF has an alternative or like distinct internal link into the disad's impacts. So going back to my analogy, there's a different chain of dominoes to that same endpoint, right? Like the negatives disadvantage has one chain of dominoes, right? It's like one color. The affirmative has another chain of dominoes, different color, but it's leading to the same endpoint. Now, which side comes out on top depends on internal link debating. So say the negatives disad is like a bill that contains some, I don't know, like climate agriculture provisions. Well, the AF is going to want to say that's a weaker internal link than the plan, which like maybe, for example, creates tons and tons of solar farms, right? So you can understand how like the affirmatives, quote unquote, internal link is like much larger, like much greater than the negatives internal link, because one is like a pretty massive scale of like doing climate policy, that's much more likely to be effective. And the other is like small scale climate agricultural action. Second advanced argument is intrinsicness. So fiat is basically like the active imagination we use to pretend like the affirmative plan is going to get passed or a negative counterplan is going to get passed. fiat is what like all debates, like usually all debates rely on, is like we're talking about issues that like we can't affect from in here. Like this is an academic space, so we're gonna like use our imaginations to pretend that the plan is going to pass. Now, the affirmative is going to try to use this to say like, or you should use this to try to say that proves that the disad is like sort of fake, right? Like logically, for example, if you had the affirmative, which is a bill in Congress, and there was another bill about Ukraine aid, logically, if the judge is like a policymaker that's like deciding whether or not to pass the affirmative, which is a bill, so they have to be a policymaker in Congress deciding whether or not to pass a bill, because that's what the AF is. So because we know that the judge is a policymaker, well, it just seems logical that they could also pass, like, let's say the Ukraine aid bill. Like, why is that like considered a trade-off, you know? So that's like what the affirmative wants to say is like, quote unquote, fiat solves the link, right? And this can take like many forms. So that gave you like a politics example. Let's say with like an economy example, it would be like the plan is like a structural readjustment to the economy. Last year, there was like part of the topic you could like expand Social Security. So like expanding Social Security, that like causes inflation because it pumps the economy with more money from the government. Well, intrinsicness, if the affirmative was trying to utilize it to answer a disad that was like, you're destroying the economy, the affirmative might be like the judge is like a logical, like economic policymaker and would include like counterbalancing. Like when we pump money into the economy, the judge would logically like take some money out elsewhere to like counterbalance, right? Now, the issue with this is that's like not what the plan actually does. Is just like you're specifying later in the 2AC that like you're doing some action, right, to solve, get out of like whatever disad they've read. And often that action is like not topical, right? It's not under the realm of the topic. Last year, you could give like a federal jobs guarantee, a universal basic income, or expand Social Security. If you're not familiar with what each of those mean, it's okay. You just need to know that those were the three actions you can take. Intrinsicness would be like justifying like, well, you could expand Social Security, and then if you wanted to, you could counterbalance by like taking money out of the economy elsewhere. Like, no, taking money out of the economy elsewhere, that's like an action that like is not under the realm of the topic. So if you're negative and wondering how to answer like fiat solves the link or intrinsicness, you should appeal to like fairness, like it's or like education. Like it seems pretty bad from like an education standpoint to allow the affirmative to just get out of everything, you know, every bad consequence by just saying like, oh, by the way, like we didn't like say or tell you this earlier, but like actually we do end up like doing something to address that, you know. Okay, those I think were the two like more advanced parts of the disad I wanted to talk about. Um, let me think. Okay. Does anyone have any questions? All right. If not, I'm going to talk more about the politics disad because I think that that's like a pretty common one that you'll end up like facing next year. So there's like three main types of politics disads. There's an agenda disad, an elections disad, or what's called a base disad. So an agenda disad is some bill is going to pass, right? This is like the Ukraine example I gave. Some bill is going to pass. Passing that plan causes the bill not to pass. Passage of that bill is pretty important, right? Um, that's essentially it, like very simplistic, straightforward. The elections disad says, like the example I gave with Trump, someone's going to win the election. Passing the plan causes that person to lose the election. That other person is bad, or the one election that's in office or the one official who's in office is good. The base disad is like a leader has support now, passing the plan causes a lack of support. And then the most common one on this is like losing support causes the leader to like do like a policy. And normally the policy that they do is like they attempt to like divert attention through like a war. So it's called like diversionary war. It's pretty common when like a country's economy is like struggling a lot. A leader obviously like doesn't want like the citizens of that country to be like, yo, like the economy's really bad. Like, what's our leader doing? Like, he's supposed to be like helping us. Like, he's running the country poorly. So the leader is going to be like, no, like I'm gonna try to divert attention away from that by initiating a war. And um, like normally wars are accompanied with like a bunch of like nationalism or like love for your country. And so normally that like gets people to forget about like bad conditions and they end up supporting that leader again. Um, so sorry. Oh, okay. So for uniqueness, specific this is like specific to politics more so, but like I think you could apply these to like other things, um which is that there's a need to like extrapolate like warrants. So um warrants are like the like I showed you like those highlighted cards for like Ukraine. Warrants would be like each sentence says like a different thing, has a different reason that like the plan or Ukraine aid is like going to pass. So this can include like experts, insiders, those who know what's actually happening. Um, and this is um, those are basically like uh what's who they know like what's actually going on. Predictive, the evidence is explicit on like this is going to happen in the future, right? It's very like definitive. Vote counts can also be helpful. They show like how close, far apart the issue is. It means it's easier for a judge to like quantify that in their head. Momentum, it takes like the attitude of people like into account. Um, then polls, elections, uh, like who's polled, what type of questions they ask, etc. The more specific those are, the more your judge is like going to find your evidence very like credible, right? So when you're looking through like starter pack evidence from like a lot of camps, I know this summer put out like evidence on like politics or whatever, or when like next year you can like download like other teams' evidence off the wiki, right? Which is like the basically an open source website where you can like download documents from any given debate. You should look for cards and like take cards that are include like as many warrants as possible, include as many of those things I just talked about. Um, so then link debating. One of the strengths of um, politics disads is they can have multiple links, right? The first one is political capital. So political capital is a concept that like there's a finite amount of influence that a leader can have to push bills through Congress. So think about it like monopoly money, right? Like Biden has a specific amount of monopoly money that he can dole out to Congress or the Senate and like get them to pass certain policies, right? Now, normally a leader has the most political capital at the start of their term, and they never like, usually it's theorized that they can never gain more political capital. They can only lose it, right? So the argument is like, um, the plan trades off because pushing the plan through requires that leader's use of political capital, which means that they won't have enough political capital to push through like Ukraine aid. The second type of link is bipartisanship, right? Our Congress is made up of like two bi-parties, Republican and Democrat. When the parties like work together, the bill is universally supported. It's considered like quote unquote bipartisan, right? Um, but let's say they're working together on Ukraine aid now. but another bill comes through that like one of the sides really doesn't like. That's probably going to derail their bipartisan spirit that they've been like um, sort of channeling through on the other Ukraine aid they've been working on, right? Um, lastly, this one is like probably not good, but like if like you have extra time when you're extending the disad, it's floor time, right? So the amount of time that the bill takes to be debated will make it so that the other bill cannot pass because like discussing Ukraine aid or discussing like the plan, so like expanding Social Security or something, takes up so much time that they won't have time to discuss Ukraine aid at all, right? Um, so those are like links on politics. Um, and then let me think. I covered impact calculus. I'll just go back to like extending into the block. Uh, this is like less specific to disads, but like really like any off case position you're extending, which is that I think the best way to organize it, if you can, right? Like this is very hard at the start to do. But if you start working on it early, um, here, one sec, I'm gonna move because I think there's a lot of background noise. All right, sorry about that. Okay, so wait, what was I covering? Um, Oh yeah, extending. So I think the earlier you start doing this, the better shape you'll be. And like judges find when you're very clear, um, it's really easy to follow. So it could be ordering your arguments in the order of the 2AC. So when I take a disad in like I'm the 2A, and that means I'm the 1N. So I'll normally extend the disad into the 1NR, right? So I'll cover like I don't know, like I'll say like first, as always, like impact framing should go at the top. Uh, so that like goes out of 2AC order, but that's like the only thing, right? So I'd be like nuclear war turns climate change, blah, 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 explain a little bit, maybe a few sentences, talk about the impact. And then you can read like extra impact cards. Those are called like add-ons to the disad. You would say like, oh, like also the disad, the internal link of the disad also triggers this other impact. So if it's like Ukraine aid, for example, an internal link could be like, or like an add-on could be like, oh, by the way, if we don't pass this aid package, that means also Taiwan like perceives the United States as like not a very credible friend, not a very credible ally, which means they're gonna like acquire nuclear weapons or something like that, which causes war. So that's an example of like a separate, distinct add-on impact that is different from your original 1C impact. And then after that, you would go in order. Say 2AC, like the first argument made in the 2AC was no link argument. I'd say like 2AC1, and then I'd be like, yes, link. I'd extend, make sure you're always extending your 1C evidence. I see this a lot in the novices I coach, but they don't extend the 1C evidence. They just end up reading new cards, which is just like a waste, given you spent probably like a minute and a half to 2 minutes reading that evidence in the 1C. Um, okay, that was all I had. I know that was a lot. Um, so I'm just gonna like open it to questions now. And again, y'all can like just throw stuff in the chat if y'all don't want to like unmute.